It helps many of the developing countries if they can test these technologies, and if we can also incorporate feasibility studies, and this also helps the investment later on. So my first message would be that we need to have more projects in maritime decarbonization, not just by IMO, don't get me wrong, as head of projects, I'm happy if the projects are not with us, but we definitely need to have more projects. And we also need to have more projects that have on-the-ground activities and they do pilots. The second lesson we learned is that we are not alone. So we are not alone and we cannot do this alone. This means on the international level for IMO that we need to work with other international agencies, let it be other UN bodies, UNDP or UNCTAD, or I could go along. I'm not going to name them all. Let it be IFIs. I will go back to the international financial institutions later. But also on the country level, it's extremely important that the dots are connected. For those of you who have been listening to all the maritime events, and by the way, we could fill a pavilion easily. There were so many maritime events during this COP. Those of you who are listening, I'm sure you all heard that one of the key issues mentioned is alternative fuel development and how big of a potential, and you've heard Madame Nancy also in her opening speech, how big of a potential is there, especially in Africa, for alternative fuels development for maritime. So I think here it's extremely important that we connect the dots also within the countries. The energy ministries need to talk more with the maritime industry. The maritime transition needs to be part of the overall energy transition. And if we look at it from the other way around, we need to make sure that maritime will be able to benefit from the future fuels and the alternative fuel potential of Africa. The third takeaway, I would say, is investment. So our lesson is also key that we cannot start thinking early enough about investment. So IMO as such is not providing investment. We are not a bank. But we are aware that we really need to work closely with the IFIs, with the financial institutions, right from the beginning to make sure that these pilots that we are undertaking at the end are resulting in bankable projects and investment. You may have heard we also have something called FinSmart. It's a roundtable we are leading together with World Bank and EBRD that has been looking into financial instruments of maritime decarbonization. And up until now, we had very interesting work, but rather theoretical. And we would like to move now to the next phase, where we will look at concrete pilot ideas for small-scale investment from the IFIs and interested donors. But we will also look at upscaling pilots and bigger investments. It's been also clear that some of the countries, the maritime administrations may not be aware even of ongoing investment negotiations that they are having with some of the IFIs on alternative fuels. So we need to really connect the dots there too, and we hope that FinSmart will have a strong role in this. And the MTCCs also have a key role in FinSmart and in connecting the dots. Finance is one big angle of it, but the other big angle is R&D. And this is what IMO CARES is really about. The R&D needs of the South need to be connected with the R&D centers and technology centers of the North. Technology deployment is a key area, and we need to look at how we can share best practices and how we can connect the technologies, the knowledge of the North with the South, especially Africa. And I'm very happy to know that we will have the MTCC's support in this, also in IMO CARES. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Georgie, for that intervention. As we link it to what Ocean Hub is about, I welcome Mr. Alexis. And Mr. Alexis, I welcome you to give us an insight on as the Pan-African Business Accelerator, supporting exclusive innovators with ocean sustainability, this being at the core of business, what is, according to you, the state of play of African-based innovations and technologies to decarbonize maritime transport? And also, how does this compare with the rest of the world?
Thank you very much. What's the state of play of innovation in Africa when it comes to greening maritime shipping? A lot of R&D happens in the south. The difference, without jumping to the second part of the question, is really that the lead times are much longer, and we're suffering from this in the global south. So indeed, support from the north, exchanging notes and lessons could definitely help. Now, in terms of kind of breakthrough innovations that we've been working on with entrepreneurs in Africa, at Ocean Hub Africa, we've had bio-LNG, liquid natural gas, and especially focusing on a just transition. It's not just about creating a new decarbonized fuel, it's leveraging this challenge as an opportunity for just transition. We've worked on technology to implement hard sails and morphing blades that can be applied to offshore wind, but also to hard sails for shipping. This technology is a South African IP, but it will never fly, weird pun, if it's not adopted by the R&D centers and the regulators in the global north. We've also been working on the ship hull cleaning robots and ROVs, remotely operated vehicles. The same. There's been a lot of breakthroughs done, perhaps even before it was happening in the global north, but then the global north took over. And that's the big difference. To the second part of your question, that's the big difference between Africa and the rest of the world, and especially the more sort of industrialized world, is that things tend to take a bit more time because of lack of capacity, of resources. The knowledge and the opportunities are tremendous and have amazing potential in Africa, but there's fewer resources dedicated to support those efforts, which makes the innovation a bit longer to reach market stage, and without the equivalent support that you would get in Europe or in the USA, for example. In the rest of the world, you have new ship designs altogether, super fancy, hydrodynamic, aerodynamic, new paints, or even the material that are hydrophobic. Those boats are gliding on the water, supposedly, we'll see. These type of major investment and breakthroughs are harder to achieve in Africa because of lack of support. And then to the last point, perhaps to what you were saying earlier, in order to accelerate that transition in Africa, perhaps if those innovations already exist in the global north, an option would be to provide support to soft land those innovations into the global south. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Take what works, what has been demonstrated, wherever it has happened, and work to implement those technologies by building capacity, localizing it, ensuring some local ownership, so it's not only dependent on whoever built the technology, and ensuring in the same token a just transition. Once again, this is super important. It's a massive challenge, decarbonizing shipping, but it's also a huge opportunity. And that is really the key word. And we've heard it a lot here at the COP, but we won't hear it enough.
Thank you very, very much. And I see next to you is Mr. Nelson from the ICS, representing the private sector, the enablers of the shipping industry. And for you, we would like to know, how can ICS play a leading role in formulating regional plans that seek to put in place low carbon fuel production? And this is around the port limits. And does this make sense? Does it need to be rephrased?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. And I've listened to some of the interventions here, and there's a lot of work already done in place on technology transfer that seems to be an issue, capacity building, the importance of safety, seafarers, the just transition. There are several initiatives out there. From the private sector, what we noticed this year when we met at our summit in London was that first, we should not continue just to focus on shipping decarbonization, but we should focus on the enabling role of shipping in the wider energy transition. I think we were one of the first ones to come up with this even since the last COP26. And we have pursuing that pathway. So within the region with Africa is understanding which countries have an interest in providing these fuels at scale, these low carbon fuels, working with industry in identifying not only the location, but making sure those plans are inserted in the Ministers of Energy long-term plans, and facilitating the de-risking of investment in these projects. So that is one of the key things that ICS is trying to help by creating the initiative Clean Energy Marine Hubs. So countries that are interested in following that path and that have the capacity, that have the land resource, that have the wind and solar and other renewables. By the way, Africa has strong resources in hydropower. How does that convert then to a potential export market? Not everyone's there. There are a few countries already started in the project, and that's something that we will be working together with the ports, with the energy providers, with the finance sector, and with the governments.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the insight from the private sector. And next on stage is Mr. Charles from the Lloyd's Register. And the Lloyd's Register does have an in-depth industry placement on matters maritime decarbonization, also having a maritime decarbonization hub. And for you, the question is, how can we put this into practice? And in addition to this, what can Lloyd's support in terms of collaboration through the establishment of regional presence in areas like Africa?
Okay, so it's a good question. How do we put things into practice? And it's actually, we've talked before about collaboration, but collaboration is only going to work if we have the action with it. So about November time last year, we released a paper called the First Movers Framework, which really looked at trying to break that chicken and egg between the shippers, the shipping companies requesting a fuel but no fuel available, and on the other hand, the fuel producers wanting to produce a fuel but needing a demand signal. And there's very few shipping companies out there who can produce that demand signal enough to de-risk the investment. So it's about pulling people together. So at the moment we've got one project, it's based out of Singapore called the Silk Alliance, and there we've pulled in 5 industry-leading shipping container companies, Asian Development Bank and another bank and some other companies, and it's working together to build up that demand signal. Phase 2 of this then moves into pulling in the fuel producers to be able to match that demand signal. And this is, we're testing this, and I said this is, yeah, we've got to do action. Everything is a first mover at the moment. But this can then be applied to other regions as well. And actually, when we've been looking at our analysis and our modeling for the fleet we've got at the moment, this touches into Nairobi and other countries down the east coast of Africa. So there's a synergy there which we then hope to link in and be able to sort of bring in and see how the two can then merge together. Because whilst all these corridors and areas are individual at the moment, the power to scalability will be to when they all link together. And that's going to be when we'll really see a catalyst of change. But there's a few things that, I mean, there's 2 ways of looking at it. There's one way of looking at it as I call this shipping business as usual, with the shipping companies coming together. And it's going to be a case of, right, who are we competing with fuel, who are we competing with renewable energy? The other part is more of a collaboration internally, and probably a bit more what Nelson is talking about as well, in terms of when we're looking at a port and we're looking at other energy producers, other energy users. So we're not collaborating with other, well, we're collaborating with shipping, but we're collaborating shipping with other energy users as well, such as steel production, and others, and there you could have a catalyst around a port. And the power there is it's more sustainable for a longer term. The country or the region will be exporting green steel, it'll be producing more valuable goods, as well as energy and being a vector as well. So there's a few things there which sort of tie in, and that's the way we're looking at in the future, and we look forward to working with MTCC and the IMO CARES moving on.
Thank you very much for that insight. We look forward to the collaborations, and now we are moving into the financial sectors to hear what the banks have to comment about this. And this question is for Mr. Mubarak, who is from the West African Development Bank. And the question is, as a regional development bank, what are today the key financial instruments that can be brought on board towards a green transition in the maritime and shipping sector? And do you notice any finance projects that may be having a gap in this sector?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. And I will start with the first question, because then you will see that the second question, I mean, because you will see that it answers partially to the first question. During the last strategic plan that we developed, we had an assessment to see why those companies and why those sectors don't have enough funding. And one of the key elements that we found is the building of the projects, the origination of the project itself. Because many times here we are talking about decarbonizing, we are talking about finance, lack of financing, we are talking about everything, but we're not talking about the core thing, the main thing. The main thing is how you structure your projects. The building of the project is key, because if you don't build with the eligibility criteria that it takes to decarbonize or that it takes to raise climate finance, then you don't get the finance at the end of the day. So one of the things that we are really working on is how to build projects with especially with the private sector, and then we see what kind of elements we can use. And one of the things that we also figured is that the cost of finance is one of the reasons why we don't mobilize enough financing. And that's where carbon finance comes into the picture, because to us, carbon finance is an enabler, is one of the resources that we use to reduce the cost of financing. And we have developed instruments where we use carbon finance as incentive to lower interest rates. I don't know if in English you call it, to lower the interest rates. There is a term that you use, to bonify interest rates. So we use carbon credits we have a pool of carbon credit that we use to bonify interest rates. So not only you lower the interest rate, but we have mechanisms that we use as well to have a longer maturity for private sector, because those are key elements. And when we were doing the Blue Economy Strategy with the African Union and the West African Economic and Monetary Union as well, we figured that there are many sectors that can use to mobilize blue economy to finance all the different sectors. And we figured you could use blue economy when financing the hotel sectors. You could use it to even finance the road construction and so on and so forth. So those instruments give you a leverage to mobilize better resources to finance all the sectors. And that's something that we're really working on. There are many countries in our region. When you talk about Niger, for example, people will ask you, why would you talk about Niger when talking about blue economy? But then with the African Union strategy, you can have blue economy projects developed along the Niger River, for example. And there as well, we find with this new crisis, terrorist crisis in the region, we figured that developing projects along that area as well, you can use blue economy to fight terrorism, to create jobs, and to have some kind of in agriculture, in shipment, in the development of local communities. So there are many areas where we figured that decarbonizing not only will help to get funds, but also you can mix it with other instruments to develop other type of projects. And then we're working on sorry about my English, I sometimes lose my words in English. We are working on finance modeling that we can use to develop those kind of projects. And you see that when you combine many of these instruments, because you combine not only resources from the private sector, and you combine them with the publicly available resources. We are discussing right now with the GCF, for example, to tell them that not only you are not able to mobilize the 100 billion that you promised for financing projects. But then we can also work to see how we can develop instruments, guarantee instruments to private sector, and also some kind of incentives to drag private investment to the table. Because the only way we can finance NDC and we can finance all these big development projects is how we enable private sector to be interested in financing these projects. So those are some kind of instruments we are doing. And doing that, we also saw that the enabling environment is key. So we created the West African Alliance on Carbon Markets and Carbon Finance that supports countries' participation into the negotiations. So we support the negotiation with countries. We also support their participation in capacity enhancement, capacity development on the ground, not only to the technical people, but to local communities and local people as well. So those elements are really important in mobilizing climate finance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mubarak, for the elements that you have highlighted. And the question to Dr. Dosuma from the African Development Bank, before we open up the floor for plenary session. The question is, what are the main barriers to financial flows, and what harnessing support can be given to countries to support reforms in the efforts?
Thank you, Lydia, for this very important question. First, before I address your question, let me mention that the shipping industry is a sector that is relevant both for adaptation and mitigation. Here at COP27, we know that this is a sector that remains very vulnerable to the climate risk, especially sea level rise, with a significant economic and financial costs on the industry. And we also know that the sector is contributing significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. So we need a dual approach towards that sector. It's not just about decarbonizing, the sector, but also making sure that the sector remains resilient to the negative impacts of climate change. Coming to your question, I think there are several barriers. Some of them have been mentioned by my colleagues. I want to mention the fact that, supporting the transition of the sector will require significant resources. Actually, it's going to be very costly. So we need a mix of several instruments, both public, private, but also innovative sources of finance. From public sector, of course, resources are available, but they are limited. So how we can use public sector resources to leverage private finance, especially in that sector where investment are very costly. But other sources of finance will include, for instance, the use of proceeds of the green bonds. That this is a sector that is emerging, and we need to capture the resources that are available there to support the decarbonization and resilience building of the sector. Coming to the barriers, I think one of them being the lack of regulatory frameworks and incentives at country level, especially from the government institutions, to ensure that to create the necessary enabling environment for private capital to flow into the sector. So I think there is a work to be done at regulatory level to make sure that we have the necessary regulations to finance the sector. Last but not least, I think the issue of taxonomy. We need to qualify what kind of activities or support we need here in that sector. What do we qualify as elements or components that need to be supported in that sector as far as adaptation and mitigation are concerned. So I think there is a lack of understanding yet in that sector, especially when it comes to decarbonization and building resilience. And I think there is a need to do some work on taxonomies or frameworks to understand better the sector. Thank you, and I would like to excuse myself because I have another panel starting at 5 p.m. in the MDB Pavilion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the highlights. Thank you very much for the comments. I now open up the floor for some comments and questions. I give the floor to Mr. Abdul for the comment. I'll request the microphone to be passed to him. Avland. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Abdul. I work with the Ghana Shippers Authority. Lydia is a colleague of mine. We studied at IFLOTS at the Hamburg. My question or comment goes to Mr. Bukaila. You spoke about the project concept. So what has been the support of the African Development Bank in providing guidelines for investment into the maritime sector when it comes to climate change and adaptation? And then I also want to congratulate Lydia for the work that she's doing. We were very privileged to be one of the first countries to receive the MTCC Africa for a workshop, especially on data collection. And it has helped a lot, especially when it comes to our approach in energy around the port, especially with light industries, which my good friend is interested in. How do we create opportunities for other users of the port when it comes to the energy transition? So it's not focused mainly on shipping or shipping companies. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. We actually developed many different instruments. It's not specific to the maritime sector, and it's actually an instrument that we developed to work closely with project developers when incorporating eligibility criteria. So we have a mapping of different institutions that finance all kind of sectors, and when you bring a project from one sector, we sit down with you and go through the project to see what you want to have in the project. Because usually when project developers develop their projects, they develop the project before looking for the financial institution. What we do here is look at all available resources that we have, and then we tell you, according to your projects, the needs, if you need this kind of resources for your studies, you need this for implementation, and you need this to develop an MRV and so on and so forth. So that's the work that we are able to do. So we look together with the project developer at what different instruments and schemes are out there to support that project in that sector. And from there, we build the project. And we found out that's very important. And we started that with the implementation of the first regional collaboration center because of the lack of projects in the CDM. So we developed we developed with the UNFCCC the first regional collaboration center in Lomé, and from there we saw that using that kind of methodology helped to increase the development of CDM projects. So we use that same metrics in other sectors, and it has been very successful, in fact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Might there be any other question to the panelists? I see.
Okay, no, maybe the audience first. I will hand it over to you. But
Okay.
I had a question. We talked about de-risking investment, the cost of that risk for the investment. How does that compare to the cost of not investing?
I'm Joseph Sonzala from Kenya. My question mostly go to Lydia. What can countries like Kenya do now in the face of the various obstacles to ensure that they're able to undertake the transition?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the highlights. And the answer to this question is what countries like Kenya can do. As you know, Kenya hosts the MTCC Africa. And with this, we have the pilot projects. The pilot projects are very insightful in benchmarking, looking at the ground needs of the country, looking at the ports and the energy transition sector, seeing the needs to have alternative fuels, working together with stakeholders. Stakeholder engagement is very key and paramount. With the International Maritime Organization, we have the Global Industry Alliance that puts in place the private sector at a global scale so that we have the global North-South cooperation. These are some of the factors that we have been putting in place to support, and we look forward to having more inclusive participation, especially now that we have COVID, which is slowly opening up the business environment in the shipping industry. So I hope I have answered your question. In the best interest of time, I will give a quick fire closing remarks.
I will just answer your question by using the same words that the President Al-Sisi used at the beginning of the COP. He said, inaction today is between 7 to 10 to 15 billion dollars per year. So do we want to keep losing when we don't even have the resources? So we need to work towards action, regardless. I hear sometimes some people say, oh, we are not the one that did that polluted and everything. But coming here, we use planes, right? So to develop planes and everything, they had to pollute and everything. So we need to use a smarter way to do our development, and that's what is at stake here. Thank you.
Thank you. I will call for quick closing remarks from the panelists, and we can close the session.
Can we start? Okay.
Yes, please.
I'm good.
Okay, I'll just quick fire. Closing remarks and listening to what hasn't been covered, and something I really wanted to pick on was people. This is about people. Nothing will happen without people getting the action together, to bring in the finance, to get the project started. But moving through this, it's going to be a key aspect of skills. And in the industry, in the shipping industry, we're really going to struggle with skills. But we also know that the other industries are going to struggle with these skills as well. Hydrogen specialists, for example, are not available today. They're not falling off trees. There's a unique opportunity here, particularly for Africa, where you're going to be producing the fuels and producing hydrogen, that actually is to develop a lot of core expertise. That could be land-based, but actually that expertise is needed for the seafarers as well, for those overhauling machinery. So there's a huge part here of skills, and collaboratively, that's where I see the big power. So yeah, working together, but skills, and skills. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Charles. We know the skills element. Welcome, Nelson.
Yes. I don't know why today we haven't spoken about the amount of fuels required. The scale is tremendous. Shipping alone for its fuels will require the whole renewable energy capacity in the world right now. Where is that going to come from? I mean, it's not about small projects, little pilots here and there, opportunities for hydrogen, ammonia. No, it's a massive number of, that's what the opportunity is. So the finance, the skills, the capacity building has to be in that order. It's not about shipping's fuel. It's about the world's needing those fuels for shipping to transport. That has to be the mindset change. It's a tremendous amount of scale. Just yesterday, we published our report to Understanding Shipping's Role in the Energy Transition. It's going to change. The mix of fuels will change. Coal will change. Gas, oil will not be transported in the same amounts. That will affect your businesses, your communities, but it will also provide these other opportunities. The trend is coming. And in addition, only 4% of the hydrogen projects are actually in closing finance, and none of them are close to ports. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that challenge. Welcome, Mr. Alexis.
I'll say exactly the opposite. I think we need smaller tickets to develop a bigger pipeline, stop the risk in investment, and the due diligence increases with the size of the ticket. We need to get new solutions out, and they need to come from anywhere they can happen. And so de-risking investment is an important factor, I agree, but de-risking the pipeline builders, entrepreneurship, and solution makers, I believe, is equally important, because if you just pour money onto a dry land, nothing is going to happen. You need to have this fertile land and this seed before you can pour the water onto it.
Thank you, and welcome, Georgie, for your closing remarks.
Okay, so I think we can all agree that maritime is key for trade, it's key for energy transition, because indeed it will be the one that, just like every trade and commodity, will take the new energy around, but it also needs to have new fuels, and we all know that. And we also know that those new fuels are out there, the technology is out there, the question is the scale. It's a huge opportunity for developing countries that can provide alternative fuels. We heard before about skills. I would go one level lower, knowledge. I think that every time we have our projects, workshops, we have events like this, it becomes clear by the questions that there are some serious knowledge gaps. On the one hand, there are knowledge gaps outside of the maritime community, because we always see the same people in the event. There's a huge gap of knowledge of outside of the maritime community about the importance of the industry and about the huge needs of the industry and the huge potential for investment and the huge potential for development in Africa and in developing countries. This would need to change, and we need to change it, and we need to start talking with people who we are not comfortable talking with. Let it be the foreign ministry in the country, let it be some banks, let it be some very future-looking minded NGOs, but we definitely need to start talking outside of our comfort zone. Also, the maritime industry and the maritime stakeholders, even ports, where I have to say the majority of the investment will need to happen, and where the investment is the easiest in the sense that it's an infrastructure investment, they may not have the necessary knowledge on how to raise funds and how to get projects done. So we just had questions about this too. How will I have a bankable project? These questions we hear every day at IMO from the countries, and I think it's something that we need to seriously start also addressing, to build the capacities of the countries to raise funds. Many of them are not aware that feasibility studies, for example, can be done for free by many of the IFIs. You know, for seeds and for small island developing states and least developed countries, many times there's free grants out there from IFIs. And they are also not aware how to afterwards sell the project once you have a grant for a bigger investment internally that the country can agree to a concessional loan or loan. So I think that we have a lot to do on the connecting the dots, and also to raise the knowledge about the importance of the maritime industry, the importance and the opportunities about the maritime's role in alternative fuels and in transition. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Georgie, for the highlights. As we give the closing remarks, I picked up a few points that I will give a brief highlighting to. The first point is to have the recognition of the global North-South network support. We also need to look at the regulatory aspect, need for collaboration for the public-private partnerships, and most importantly, develop new technologies through R&D. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving us your time, and it is now the end of the session. I wish you a pleasant evening. Thank you.
Hey, test. Hey, test. Hello, check. Hey, test. Hey, test. Hey, test. Hello, check.
Hello. Please, can you come to the front, please? So that we will not have to shout. Chucks, you can come over here. You can come over here. Yeah? Yes. You have your computer? Where you put the computer? Yes, it's here. The computer. You give them the slides. Okay.
premises that we kicked off with. The first is that, of course, renewables will have a significant role to play in terms of serving as the long-term foundation of an African energy systems for development and addressing climate goals. However, these pathways, in terms of how to get there, they are going to be quite diverse across countries. And then this, in terms of the content, that there is a drive towards domestic net zero goals by northern countries. But at the same time, in recent years, we've seen investments in new natural gas infrastructure spreading into Africa using funds from the north. We also have witnessed, of course, we've seen the failure of the $100 billion for climate finance, and we've been talking about this endlessly for the past 10 years or so. Now, from the African side, what the kind of narrative that's emerging, or discussions that are emerging, is that pointing out at the sort of double standards by northern countries, and particularly for this increasing call for gas for export to Europe. Now, as key issues go, we felt that there's a need for a much greater understanding of country-specific energy systems as starting points. There's a need for putting development at front and center into our energy conversations, and also the importance of evidence in order to be able to articulate whatever position we will come up with in terms of driving the energy-enabled development. Now, one thing in the data that we pulled together, as you can see, this is a country-specific levelized cost of electricity against percentage of access. And it is a very muddled kind of picture, what we are seeing. And of course, the black dot is about high natural gas reserves, and the diamond blue is high content of fossil fuel in terms of generation share. So we are not really seeing a major pattern, and I'm mainly talking about Africa outside of North Africa and South Africa. So it's a very checkered picture. So we don't have a full picture on this. And part of this spread that we're seeing has nothing to do with resources, because as far as solar energy is concerned, you can say it is more or less uniform across the continent. But what's different about it is, the issue around the cost of capital, for example, which mediates, which kind of influences the way in which, in terms of, the price of PV. So what we also did was we took Agenda 2063 as a basis, because it is the Pan-African agenda that we came up with, and the AU came up with in 2015. And out of this, we looked at some of the specific objectives that directly impinge on energy systems in terms of the choices that we have. So we have the economic goals, the social goals, and ecological goals as a way to think and to organize how energy systems interact across these goals. Of course, we know that the Agenda 2063, I believe it predates SDGs. Am I right? Yeah. But nonetheless, it is the kind of vision that we used as a basis for the analysis that we did. Now, I'm running quite rapidly into the paper. What so we zeroed it, to 4 separate countries, just to illustrate what we had been thinking about. So on the one hand, you have a country like Ethiopia that has been driving the climate and development agenda for the past 10 years or so. And of course, over this period, we've seen the renewables taking a much deeper root in Ethiopian power sector. And so the high renewable share in Ethiopia, we expect that to continue, partly because the policies are there, the institutions are being built, and also the cost of renewables in Ethiopia. I mean, the most recent one that we came across was 2 kilowatt hours per 2 cents per kilowatt hour. It's one of the lowest costs that we are seeing. So we expect this to continue. South Africa has a very different picture. South Africa has, of course, its base load or its energy system is very much coal-based, but at the same time, it's also managed to bring down the cost of renewables significantly, more or less, to the same level as Ethiopia. But the other thing, of course, is that South Africa has the institutions, the policies to be able to back this up. So the expectation is that South Africa's uncertainties when it comes to whichever pathway to take is much narrow, is not as narrow as Ethiopia's at this stage, but certainly quite narrow. So we expect the high renewable share to materialize in South Africa. Burkina Faso is a somewhat of a different context. We're talking about very low electrification access, and much of that is going to be modular, largely because of settlements and the way in which the economy of Burkina Faso is organized. And so, there will be a much greater uncertainty in terms of reaching the high renewables share for Burkina Faso. Mozambique, Senegal, and a couple of other African countries have recently discovered oil, and so that somehow broadens the uncertainty that we would expect into the future, because Mozambique, of course, is in the process of developing hydrocarbons. Much of that, of course, is for export. The question is whether Mozambique will be in a position to develop some of these the natural gas resources for its own internal needs, for its own industrialization, and so forth. So that's a picture that it's still emerging. So the expectation is that, I think, with Mozambique, the level of uncertainty in terms of the pathways is quite wide. So it can go in the renewables direction to some extent, but certainly gas is going to feature quite strongly. Just to have a sketch, to have a look at planned new capacity additions for selected African countries. Again, that picture looks quite mixed. So you can see the top countries like Tunisia, Djibouti, and South Africa, that are projecting an increase in solar and wind expansion. Senegal, Nigeria, for example, will have some gas that they have planned to develop for the power sector. So the picture looks quite mixed, when we look at select African countries. Now, what this really tells us is that the pathways, of course, the starting points and the pathways are going to be different from one country to another. And so the kind of the broad African sweep in terms of energy, the energy system doesn't quite hold water. You can see here that there are very different pathways that countries are going to embark on. Just putting that against planned new capacity in the U.S., you can see what's going on in the U.S., in many parts of Europe as well, that there is a significant expansion, a new build that we are seeing in wind, solar, and batteries. Up to 90% of that is going to come from that. So we are looking at a world which is moving in very different directions, but certainly the northern countries are investing significantly in their renewables capability. Now, this is a final, I think, slide. And this is really measures to drive energy-enabled development. I mean, the first is, of course, the geopolitical narrative, which needs to recognize energy needs. I think that's something, which is emerging. Of course, the other thing is the global north has certain, responsibility in facilitating Africa's short and long-term interests are brought to the center of the debate. But this can only be managed, and this can only be ensured if African governments themselves consider their strategic and the geopolitical nature of energy systems. So there is a need to really engage with what's happening at the global level in order to be able to push through your own development agenda. In terms of policies, we argue that evidence-based policy strategies are important to define energy pathways. These need to optimize economic, social, and ecological benefits in the way that the Agenda 2063 highlighted. And there's a need for new policy instruments to be able to implement new types of regulations and incentives as a means to create green growth opportunities. And then finally, on issues of finance, access to finance, there's no question, must be increased to cover particularly the high upfront cost of renewables. But at the heart of this is really the cost of finance, which must be reduced through a number of interventions, especially government instruments. Now, we're talking about concessional loans, blended finance, guarantee mechanisms, etc. There are all sorts of instruments that are out there, but they need to fit the country's fiduciary structure, but also the country's agenda. Of course, one of the things that's not really on the table, we don't see it much, is public resources. Of course, when we talk about public money, there's a tendency to kind of shy away from that. But yet, we are talking about, if we are to take, historical responsibility, there's no reason why countries in Africa must shoulder all the responsibility for expanding, green technologies. There's a need, to support some of that effort. So just about the paper, this was a paper that was African-led, in the sense that we have 54 authors in the paper, 40 of them from Africa, 50 different organizations. So a lot of conversation was brought into this paper, and it really is a discussion paper more than anything else. There's still quite a lot of unpacking and a lot of work that needs to be done, but it has generated quite a lot of interest. We've had something like 10,000 downloads just in the first 2 weeks of the paper. So we're happy that this has generated interest, but we're also eager for it not to rest there, but for us to continue doing further work. Yuba, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jacob, for this highlight and of number of issues that has been addressed in the paper. Just picking one critical element, this is evidence-based. Evidence-based means research. And let me turn to Chucks. I just want the panelists to be very short so that we can have interaction among the panelists and then with the audience also. Evidence-based means research. The question could come to my mind, and then from your experience, from your knowledge, how much African country and African institutions, such as African Development Bank, NEPAD, African Union Commission, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, how much importance they attach to research on sustainable energy pathway in a continent, or at national level, if at all.
Thank you, Yuba. This question perhaps would have been better answered by Fatima, who is networked into the UNU, INRA. So maybe I will speak slightly and pass the microphone to her. My sense is, please forgive me if you think I'm too blunt, African institutions don't value research as they should. I'm speaking from my own personal experience. Before Europe and America will make any investment, they do detailed analysis. They take it from right, left, center. They do modeling, they do scenarios, they do long-term range planning. Many years ago, I was involved in long-range planning for China 2070. So there's already thinking about how China may look like by 2070 in detail. I worry that a lot of Africans, institutions and nations put forward targets, pledges, and there's very limited research behind it. I can tell you clearly that when the net zero target for Nigeria was announced, there wasn't deep, detailed research. And it turned out that the Nigerian net zero target document has nothing to say about AFOLU. And yet AFOLU constitutes about 39% of Nigerian emission. So how can you achieve a net zero target without AFOLU? UNESCO analysis shows that only the solid research on climate change, Africa accounts for about 1.9%. Of all the total funding that goes into research in the climate change, only 2% come to Africa. And of the 2%, if you slice it, actually 79% goes back to European institutions. I was trying to find which European institution actually, African institution actually give money for research. If you take away African Academy of Science, it's quite hard to find any other. I found that South Africa can sometimes give money for research. Nigerian TED Fund gives very little or no money for research. Maybe there's some good research going on because I have done the analysis for the adaptation initiative where I analyzed the Nigerian NDC, or the African NDCs to see how much quantitative analysis has gone into the adaptation. 48 NDCs are analyzed for the African Development Bank. So I'm sure some research do go on, but my experiences are we are very, very far from where we should be.
You want me to say something? Okay. Yeah, I think Professor Chooks here has said it all. But yes, I think perhaps what we should lament is the fact that research along the lines of climate change, climate diplomacy, is very much northern flavored, I think. I think that's something to lament. But it doesn't mean we should just apportion blame, to the global north. I think there is some responsibility that we bear as well, in terms of how do we actively take some of these issues and look at it from our own perspective, with a desire to say, what is an African position? What is what's our context? What's our reality in these issues? And how do we put those realities forward? Because if our research is not talking to the policy, it's very hard to think about what a proper African narrative would look like and how policymakers can be inspired by, the context of Africa, the development imperatives of Africa, the priorities of Africa, and even in terms of the sequencing, because we can't do it all in a green transition. There has to be some synchrony, some sequencing. So I think it's very important that we also bear some responsibility for the way research is conducted, our own leadership, in how we appropriate some of these issues, because we shouldn't be afraid. I mean, they're very able people in the continent who are able to lead research agendas, who are able to design research programs. So why are we not sort of taking that mantle and basically saying, this is what we want to know, and this is how what we want to know might be able to influence the continent's agenda, and then actively go and look for the organizations that need to be in the know. So from our own part, I think there are some aspects of the research that maybe we have just passively let others take the lead, But certainly we have a lot to say about loss and damage. Certainly we have a lot to say about gas and gas infrastructure, and certainly we do have a lot to say about stranded assets. You know, we have a lot to say about everything, but I think we do have a responsibility to not be shy and to basically say whether the funding is coming to us or not, we have something to say. Because a lot of these things, when we were writing this, we didn't need funds, did we? It's a knowledge capital. So it's how you mobilize that knowledge, how you bring people like Chooks and yourself, and how you sort of put that knowledge capital forward, I think that matters. So, you know, I would say, yes, there is a hierarchy of how this research is done. And to be honest, it's not positioned in a way that favors us. But we can now begin to draw that back and to begin to say we have something to say as well, and we don't want to be left out.
Okay, thank you, Fatima. The issue here is that the government institutions are not paying the attention that deserve research, scientific evidence on those different issues. Let me now get in the paper and turning to Mohammed. We are here at the COP. That means, based on the scientific assessments, including the IPCC, we need to have a deep reduction of the emissions and then to do whatever we want and then to avoid any use of fossil fuel. In that context, also, the African need development. And my question to you, is there any role for natural gas and then to play in Africa? If not, what are the evidence? Because we are talking about the evidence base. This is the science. It's not emotion. What evidence do we have? If you can quickly indicate your views on that.
Thanks, Jakob. Tough question. Yuba, sorry. You're sitting next to me and now you're confused.
Don't give me too heavy.
Now, I'm definitely sure you won't be able to carry that. Apologies. So that's a tough question, and I think we need to reflect quite deeply on the question. But before we even get to the question, I think it's important to look at the history and why we even have to answer this question, what got us into the problem in the first place. We have a climate problem, and I'm sure we will all agree that the wealthy minority, misappropriated the bulk of the carbon budget, and in the process developed on the back of fossil fuels without facing the cost of doing so. And because they've misappropriated the carbon budget, we now have to develop in a climate-constrained environment. And so the choices are choices that have been forced on us because the part of the world that is industrialized, I won't call them developed because they're maldeveloped, in my view, have taken more than 80% of the global commons of the atmospheric space. Now, the part of the world we are in the continent of Africa, we're on the front line of the climate challenge. We're the ones who are suffering first and worst the impact of climate change. But we also have, the development crisis, the energy crisis. Over 600 million of us don't have electricity. Close to 1 billion Africans don't have access to clean cooking. And so when you think about the specific context of the continent of Africa, you will realize that we have to actually confront these intersecting crises of climate, energy, and development together, and do it in a way that is climate compatible. And the reason we do it is not to help the rich world solve the problem they created, given that we don't even have the capacity in the first place, but so that we can look out for our own selfish interest and secure our people's well-being. And so for me, it's a question of people and people's security, and that is for me the driving force. I come from the northeast of Kenya, a part of the continent that is ravaged by extreme droughts that happen every 3 years now. Close to 3 million of my compatriots are on the brink of famine, and you have close to 20 million in the Horn of Africa that are actually facing starvation. Now, in such a context, do I have the luxury to argue, and I want to make this in the most simplistic way, that I have a right to development rather than a right to better development? And what is better development and what is the right to development on the surface? We could certainly develop how the rest of the world developed, and in the process increase, our consumption of fossil fuels, expand, the production of fossil fuels. And I must say, we have the right to do that, okay? But where would that get us? And I'm talking here about us as Africans, and where would that get the world? So that's my first question. The second question is, do we have an alternative development path that will allow us to address the intersecting crises of climate, energy, and development in a way that is climate compatible? And the answer to that second question is yes. The continent of Africa is incredibly blessed with renewable energy power. So we're not just blessed with fossil fuels, we're equally blessed with renewable energy power. But the challenge we face is that we don't have the finance and the clean technology to allow us to harness that resource. And so there is an argument to be made that also the paper touches on, but unfortunately the paper narrows it to the 100 billion, which we know is pittance when you assess it against the scale of the resources that we need to be able to actually lift our people out of energy poverty, but do it in a way that is climate compatible. We need trillions, not billions. And then the third question, so that I finish the three questions that I had. The third question is it right for the historic polluter? My sister Fatima was just calling them, developed in that sense. I tend to think of them as the polluting powers. They still continue to dominate the dialogue and the discourse. They still continue to control the narrative around addressing the problem in a way that is hypocritical. And I think it's important for us to call out the West hypocrisy in wanting to detect the development path of the continent of Africa, given that we didn't cause the problem, and for them to now force on us a development path because there is a limited carbon budget is, to say the least, hypocritical. But my point of departure is this. Is it enough for us to repeat their mistakes because of their hypocrisy? Or should we be thinking of an alternative development path? And how do we square now those three questions in a way that helps us address the intersecting crises of energy, climate, development, finance, health, you name them, together at the same time, lift our population out of poverty, and still not add our emissions and help the world live within whatever remaining carbon budget that is available? The second part of that question is, how do we ever repackage our engagement in this multilateral dialogue that is failing for the last 30 years to address what it was actually meant for? And as we demand for the reset of the multilateral process, how do we ensure that it actually delivers the finance and technology that Africa requires? Yes. On the question of evidence, those are my pointers. But I want us to be the generators of the evidence because it's about our people's life. But do it in a way that forces us to reset the terms of the dialogue and help us service a narrative that is Africa-owned. The narrative on climate that is mitigation-focused is actually from the polluters. The polluters want us to pay to solve a problem that we didn't cause when we don't have the capacity, and our leaders have fallen for it. Each of them have put forward an NDC that they haven't internalized what they truly mean, and a lot of those NDCs were prepared by consultants paid for by the polluter to actually corner the big emerging economies of China and India and to shame them for not stepping up with an NDC. Now, do we want to continue to fall into that trap or disown that, have, Jacob challenged us, evidence-based, analysis, modeling, development path choices for the continent of Africa. And that is what I will actually invite you to actually consider, so that as we react to the West, let's not throw the baby with the bathwater.
Sorry to press you because we only have 15 minutes remaining, and then we need to continue. In the African context, more and more countries are discovering gas. More and more are discovering, oil and different, fossil fuel. And at the same time, many people are also talking about stranded assets. Fatima, I know that your organization work a lot, invest a lot of time on stranded assets. Maybe you can introduce very briefly what that means for some of the people who never came across it. And then, is there any risk of stranded asset for Africa? If yes, is there any way of getting around it?
Thanks, Yuba. Yes, so maybe I'd say a couple of years ago we got interested in the whole idea of stranded assets. Because again, as Mohammed mentioned, many of these narratives and even concepts have been designed and led with a capital L-E-D from outside the continent, outside the places where the problems are felt. So we came in from a perspective of, is this really induced by climate, or are there other factors that are responsible for stranded assets? And to be honest, many of the policymakers we spoke to did not see climate as the main, trigger for stranded assets. I mean, stranded asset quite simply means that assets that will depreciate before their economic lifetime. So it means that they're not going to be monetized. They would very much be left in the ground because there are changes in policies, regulation, disruptive technology, potentially even security-related changes that would make those assets stranded. But talking to African policymakers, what they said was the stranding is happening as a result of poor planning. The stranding is happening as a result of infrastructure. The stranding is not happening. I mean, they don't think that their resources could become stranded because somebody else has decided to do so, or to make them stranded. It's not a demand issue from their perspective. But what it is from their perspective is, it's about how they plan, how these resources are going to be used, the infrastructure that allows them to do the planning. And they feel that if they have a strong internal market, they're not going to be faced with stranded asset resources. So it's a real thing. We are seeing companies that are divesting away from fossil fuel. I mean, now we're on a kind of energy rebound since the situation in Ukraine. So coal that was more or less, an energy that was somewhat, I think, put on the back burner, has now, been used as a substitute for electricity generation because of the fact that they need alternatives. So these resources are not going to be stranded for long. They will be stranded in the long term because obviously the policies are changing, regulations are changing. And between 2010 and 2018, African countries made close to about $184 billion out of their hydrocarbon resources. I mean, we're not going to be asking these questions if the tables were turned. We're not going to be asking these questions about what are we going to do with our resources and, the issue of natural gas. If we were dealing with the global south, that we're sitting in this situation where Africa is, these questions, because they would not even listen to us, they will do what is in their best interest. So I think that there is a development imperative there, like Mohammed mentioned. But we also have almost, I think it's a false choice, because the space for the carbon budget has been taken away from us. The capacity is constrained. The knowledge is also limited. We need to be able to know what is going to happen in terms of knowledge on carbon risk, which we often do not know. We need to be able to know what is going to happen in terms of the market-related risk, which we often don't know. We need to be able to understand what's going to happen in terms of regulatory framework, which we don't know. So there are so many other factors that have to be factored into this whole situation of planning ahead. And those are some of the limitations that we have on our side. We have a constrained capacity, we have a constrained knowledge, our infrastructure is constrained, the resources have been eaten up by, 3/4 of what we need to use have been eaten up. And so now, the fact that there is a push for what we need to use, whether that's renewable or otherwise, it's a decision that's made for us. So it is not foreign at all that we're being literally told that this is not a resources that you can coalesce around, that you have to look at alternative sources, and that you have to use renewable energies as your main sort of gateway to further development. So, Yuba, I mean, there's a lot to say, and it's certainly difficult to kind of get into all the complex decisions now. But what I would say is that, yes, we need to potentially think about our own development, and what that might mean is that we have a very export-led approach where our resources are concerned. Jakob said this very eloquently. So what we have to avoid is to create some kind of situation where we are producing for the rest of the world and not for ourselves. We are providing for clean energy for the rest of the world and not for ourselves. We are a place that is a holder of all these resources, but these resources are not actualized to cordon off poverty in the way that Mohammed described. So as long as we are basically on the production side and not on the consumption side, then we're not going to enjoy the benefits of a longer base or longer term development. So we have to basically say a structural dependency on natural gas, on our mineral or even the critical mineral is not the way to go. At some stage, we have to diversify our resources. So this might be an opportunity to reset the dials, but not on their terms, not on their terms. It has to be on Africa's terms, on Africa's development, on Africa's imperative for clean development, but on Africa's imperative for a development that will bring wider benefits to the rest of its people, and especially in terms of our SDGs. We're probably the only region that may not be able to achieve the SDGs, even in the next 20 years. So that tells its own story.
Thank you, Fatima. I know that we need hours and then to exhaust all those discussions. It's a bit frustrating, to just listen. And then I just, when we have 10 minutes remaining, I have a lot of questions to challenge the panelists. I know they know that I can challenge them. But I want the audience, at least 2 questions for the audience. Just be very brief. I don't want any comments, just question.
Hi, thank you. University of Oxford. My name is Alicia Leonard. I work on the same program as Jakob. And at COP, I've been hearing so many discussions about green hydrogen and people saying, oh, this is a way that the North and the South can cooperate and Africa has so much potential, and not hearing actual African opinions about their potential to export green hydrogen, or if that's even something you would want. You're saying you need to produce for yourselves before exporting, like Fatima was saying, and I would love to hear your opinions on that whole aspect of the transition in green hydrogen.
That clear green hydrogen to export.
Yeah, I enjoyed very much all what you're saying. My question would be, if Africa has to do it using our own resources, where should we start? Ethiopia has got a very good example of the dam they have built out of their own resources. We have the power, we have over 600 million people without access to electricity. If they have to start on their own, where do we start? Isn't it better to start there and let them move rather than wait for something which is promised, 100 billion, which is coming, which has not come and it will not come?
This is concrete, where to start.
Merci beaucoup. Bonsoir, c'est Oumou Modibo Keita du Mali. Je dirais que je suis émerveillé de voir le professeur sur en train de modérer. J'ai écouté tout ce que vous avez dit avec passion, mais je suis perplexe parce que je ne sais plus quoi faire. Maintenant, on parle de développement durable. Le développement durable dont on parle, elle est que pour l'Afrique ou qu'en est-il de ce développement durable du côté de l'Europe, du côté des pollueurs? Ou le développement durable est sur mesure pour les Africains? Ou que doit-on nous faire concrètement pour aller vers l'objectif essentiel qui est la lutte contre le réchauffement climatique?
Basically, she said that she's perplexed where to start for the African perspective, not in theory.
Thank you, Prof. And I want to thank the panelists for wonderful interventions. I like the point Fatima made that Africa's energy transition has to be on Africa's terms. And we all know that in July, the African Union published its African Energy Transition Common Position, which is based on the recognition that Africa wants to transition, but it will not be able to do so if it doesn't sort out problems of infrastructure and base generation, and that natural gas will have to be. Some people, including my brother Mohammed, are saying something else, and the IEA itself just published a report, and that says that Africa cannot go without gas, and even if you use so much gas in Africa, the emissions will still be very small. So, Mohammed, my question is specifically for you. Have you done any research to support the position that you are taking, that Africa should transition to renewable energy now? If so, can you tell us how Africa will be able to absorb so much solar and wind without a great infrastructure and so on? Thank you.
So, thank you very much. And I must confess, it was very elucidating, very informative, and I hope we can hold similar things more and more. It's a tragedy that there are only so few Africans listening to this. But my question, not really a question, from the presentation, I see the divergence between where the countries that have the knowledge, the countries that have the capacity are going and where Africa is going. I mean, the graph, thank you very much. The graph that you showed where US is going compared to where the rest of Africa is going, I mean, it's very telling. I was in a session earlier today where the governor of Washington, D.C. confirmed to the people who are there that by 2035 they have passed a law that there's not going to be any fossil fuel powered facility in that state. And probably that's going to be repeated everywhere. So how are we going to catch up with the rest of the world if we don't take leapfrog? You know, like Kenya, we are leapfrogging. And I think many of Africans have leapfrogged the issue of telecommunication. It is possible for us to also leapfrog and go to the new renewable energies. But if we continue talking about stranded fossils and so forth, I don't know whether that's a future for Africa. And we need people like yourselves to guide us and which direction we should take. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have 8 minutes. You are 4. Each of you have 2 minutes to convince. If you cannot take the convincing in 2 minutes, you will never be able to convince. Imagine responding to the question and reacting to the questions. You have been given a full responsibility in an African country. And then the question that came to the audience, where do we start? And then to provide a fundamental change for a better living condition for the people. Let me start with Fatima, and then I will come to Chucks and Mohammed, and then Yacob will be the last one.
So there are some options on the table, and like you said, I think green hydrogen does hold a lot of promise. I think it could also be a solution in terms of the storage difficulties that we have with renewable. But it's also important that the continent itself should get excited about what it has. The excitement is usually an excitement that's led from outside. So what it means to the continent in terms of potential innovations that could be had, ways that we could use it for production of certain types of products that we have, Africa needs to do a lot in terms of steel production, cement production, you know, and if hydrogen is going to be the way forward, then we need to be able to see what sort of partnerships can we build so that we make some breakthroughs. Usually these breakthroughs are almost led from outside, and others are getting excited about the prospects of hydrogen. And sometimes I feel that that then becomes that we become commoditized in the process. And we shouldn't be commoditized. We have a role to play. And it's essentially about people, and it's about how you make, you know, how you add quality and how you add welfare and well-being to the lives of people. So it is now becoming extremely important that we take a very sanguine look at some of these options that we have. We partner with the responsible institutions relevant, and partnerships can be done in so many different, we could partner South-South, we could partner North-South, you know, partnerships are essential. But I think, again, I just have to bring it back, what does Africa want out of this? You know, not what Africa should do because it's been told that this is what is waiting at the end of the conveyor belt, but what does Africa want, you know? And what Africa wants needs to be properly processed by Africans, you know, designed by Africans, and led by Africans. So if we are able to make those advances in terms of what we want, how we want it, and who do we bring on board, then I think we have a much stronger narrative than when others are telling us. Because that's the other thing. The problem I see in all of these discussions is that very often Africa is infantilized. Africa is told that it has to go this way, that probably by doing this it would arrive here, and probably by exploring this there are these advantages that are going to be had. So we need to get out of that infantilization process and basically be able to say, these things are possible. They're possible because we have the human capital, we have the resources, and we can make those partnerships. We can call to the table those people that we think have got the knowledge capital, and we can give them a time, you know, I mean, obviously have to give them a window whereby we can exploit those resources and see how we best serve ourselves. It's essential that Africa is looking to serve itself first. Thanks.
Jacques? My main point is that it is possible to imagine Africa, all of Africa, meeting net zero, but being poorer. We've talked about finance, but what about technology? If we force Africa, say, well, you almost all developed through renewable, and then we import all the renewable from Germany and from China, first, how we pay for that, and secondly, what will be the implication in terms of balance of trade, in terms of jobs, in terms of, so you can easily see a scenario where we can have a net zero Africa that is much poorer than today. So the question is not really renewable or gas. The question is the technology innovation, decolonizing African economy. And secondly, I find it very, very, I almost kind of, you know, stop short of shedding tears or getting angry that we're even talking about this. Because I would like to rather get into a room where we are saying we need to tell US what to do. We need to tell Europe. And I've never seen any conversation about, you know, sitting in a room discussing somebody trying to tell UK the path to follow. This is the height of, you know, trying to baby people. Sovereignty is crucial. Africa needs the right to decide the way to go. And the last thing is the research. Where is the evidence? So I'm coming back to you. The evidence, do the analysis, and then give the people the opportunity to reflect on the analysis, or even to do the analysis themselves and come up with the evidence. And we do have numbers. My brother Mohammed has talked about the fact that we need trillions, and we're talking about billions. That's an evidence. The CPI has said that we need 377 billion to do, to perform the climate actions that we put in place. Today we are receiving 30 billion. That's an evidence. Okay, so all the evidence point to the fact that some people are overusing, and yet the narrative we want to say is Africa must or must not. Any moment we spend talking to Africa is a wasted moment if the financial gap and technology gap continues to remain.
Thanks. Mohammed?
So the challenge I see here is the continent of Africa hasn't yet developed, okay? Hasn't yet developed. But the rest of the world that developed and caused the problem in the first place is actually transitioning, given the example of the US. But we want to saddle ourselves with a technology that is 100 years old rather than leapfrogging to become a renewable energy leader. Now, why will you want to miss on the opportunity of a better future that is powered by renewables just because that's what the developed world use, or rather because you have the resources of fossil fuels, like my brother Lina says? If you are to compare your fossil fuel resources against your renewable energy resources, you are equally as endowed with renewables as you are with fossil. And we're not necessarily arguing against the existing production. We're arguing against expansion of fossil fuels, especially when you're on the front line of the climate challenge and the world needs to stabilize the climate problem. If you think about people, to respond to my sister's question, and your questions, what is in the best interest of the people? And of fossil fuels. It's only been actually produced to service the interests of the foreign energy markets, not to power the continent of Africa. Why will it be different with the new expansion? So let's think it from a human perspective and must be guided by the human imperative in a climate changed world. The opportunity that the West had when they developed doesn't exist. But the energy of the 21st century is in Africa, and they want to narrow the parameters of even that energy to green hydrogen for export, not to even meet your energy and development needs. So we must reclaim our energy. And unless we decolonize, we will never decarbonize. We will never decarbonize. Let's own the narrative so that it powers our people's needs, our people's development. Let's not fall for the fossil fuel interest, particularly from foreign countries. They're not from our countries. They're from Total, they're from Eni, they're from BP, they're from Shell. Let's think what is the energy for Africa that it can be owned and controlled by Africa.
Wow, okay. I think, just to answer to your question, and Crispin as well, being perplexed is perhaps a good thing. We're all perplexed in terms of, what needs to be done, because there isn't a single way of dealing with it. Because what we are saying in this paper is, let us look within the countries, but also look beyond. Look within in terms of, what resources do we have, what institutions have we built, what capacity needs to be built in order to be able to chart a future that we choose to have. But also making sure that looking beyond. For example, on the question of, it seems that, a lot of what's happening at the moment, particularly on natural gas and what have you, is a reactive response that we are seeing. So I think, the two need to go hand in hand. I'll just end by saying, I think we're also facing a contradiction. On the one hand, there is a desperate need for quick knowledge in order to be able to move fast. At the same time, what's needed for that, it will require time, where institutions need to be built, where knowledge has to be garnered. Yeah, these are things that take time. And so I think, we are navigating a terrain, which is in contradiction in terms of the speed at which, we can move. We can only move as good as our knowledge allows us to do. So I think, building institutions without rushing, but actually taking time in order to build the types of institutions that really are compatible with the type of journey that we want to travel. Rushing and rushing and rushing seems to be where we end up, having to essentially import, knowledge, as Fatima said, for them not to fit. And And you know, we have to really start building from within. And that's going to take time, unfortunately. But you know, but the work has to start now. Yuba.
Unfortunately, the problem is time, and then the panelists have been very excellent. I can make a summary, but it will take 10 minutes. Thank you.